The first-class cabin was a world of quiet luxury, spacious seats, soft lighting, and an unspoken exclusivity. Passengers settled in, some scrolling through their devices, others adjusting their silk neck pillows. Among them sat Jason Statham, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, his face partially covered by a black mask to avoid unnecessary attention. He leaned back, arms crossed, exuding an effortless calm. Across the aisle, Richard Hale, a well-dressed businessman with a cocky smirk and an inflated sense of self-importance, eyed Jason with amusement. His smirk deepened as he nudged the man next to him. "They're letting anyone into first class these days, huh? Thought we had a dress code." A few passengers chuckled. Encouraged, Richard leaned in slightly, voice dripping with mockery. "What happened, mate? Win a free ticket? Or did you sneak in when no one was looking?" Jason didn't flinch, didn't react. Richard took that as a sign to push further. To him, this was harmless fun. He had no idea who he was humiliating. And he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Before continue, like and subscribe to catch Jason Statham's epic face-off with the arrogant man, and comment where you're watching from today. Richard Hale lived for moments like this. To him, first class wasn't just about comfort, it was about status. A place where people like him belonged, while others scraped by for a glimpse of luxury. And right now, sitting across from him was a man who clearly didn't belong. Richard's eyes roamed over Jason's plain hoodie, casual jeans, and the black face mask covering most of his face. No designer labels. No flashy watch. No aura of wealth. A nobody. His smirk widened. "Dressed like that, you'd think he wandered in from baggage handling," he mused, his voice deliberately loud enough for others to hear. A few passengers chuckled, not necessarily out of cruelty, but because they didn't want to be on the receiving end of Richard's ridicule. Others kept their heads down, pretending not to hear. Jason, however, remained still, relaxed, composed, unbothered. Richard took that as an invitation to dig deeper. "Gotta admit, mate, first class must be quite the upgrade from wherever you usually sit." "What was it?" "Seat 45B. Right by the toilets." More soft laughter rippled through the cabin. Encouraged, Richard leaned in slightly, his smirk turning sharper. "Seriously, though, a budget travel look aside, what's with the mask?" He tilted his head mockingly. "Hiding a bad haircut? Or hoping no one asks what you're doing up here?" Still, Jason didn't react. But something else did. A young man across the aisle, casually scrolling through his phone, froze mid-swipe. His gaze flickered toward Jason, narrowing slightly. Something about him, the way he sat, his posture, his stillness, felt oddly familiar. He tilted his head, brow furrowing as his eyes drifted toward Jason's wrist. A sleek, recognizable watch gleamed under the cabin lights. He squinted. Something wasn't adding up. Richard Hale was thriving. There was nothing better than an audience, an easy target, and the chance to remind everyone who truly belonged in first class, and who didn't. And this guy, sitting there in a hoodie, jeans, and a black face mask, refusing to even acknowledge him? He was a nobody. Richard let out an exaggerated sigh, shaking his head as if disappointed. Didn't realize they were letting economy passengers sneak up here. Security must be getting sloppy. A few passengers chuckled. Others glanced at Jason, then quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved. Jason, still motionless, still silent. That only fueled Richard's arrogance. "Or maybe you're one of those lucky last-minute upgrades," he mused, smirking. "You know, those pity seats they hand out when economy's too full? Must have been the best day of your life, huh?" More soft laughter rippled through the cabin. Richard leaned back, enjoying himself. Still, no reaction from Jason. Richard's smirk twitched slightly. His voice grew sharper. "Or maybe you're hiding something under that mask. What, too embarrassed to show your face? Or hoping no one asks how you actually got up here?" This time, a few passengers shifted uncomfortably. The laughter was less certain. Richard noticed. He didn't like it. His smirk returned, but it was forced now. He leaned in slightly, his tone turning nastier. "Come on, mate, let's be honest. First class isn't for everyone. Some people just don't fit in." Passengers exchanged glances. The mood had changed. Then, a tiny movement. Jason adjusted his wristwatch. A simple action. Deliberate. Unbothered. And yet, it caught the attention of the young man across the aisle. His brows furrowed. His gaze flicked down to Jason's hands, his posture, controlled, composed, too precise. Something was off. He tilted his head, staring harder at the watch gleaming under the cabin lights. Richard, still unaware, decided to go in for the kill. "How'd you even afford this seat?" he sneered. "Blow your whole paycheck just to sit here for a few hours?" Passengers stopped laughing. Some even lowered their phones, suddenly paying closer attention. A woman in the row ahead stole another glance at Jason. Her face shifted from amusement to uncertainty. The flight attendant near the galley, who had been silently observing, stiffened slightly. Meanwhile, Jason remained exactly as he was. Then, another small movement. His fingers drummed lightly against the armrest. A slow, steady rhythm. Measured. Controlled. The young man across the aisle narrowed his eyes, flicking his gaze from Jason's wristwatch back to his strong hands. His breath hitched. His mind raced, connecting dots he hadn't noticed before. Richard chuckled, assuming he'd won. But that chuckle? It was about to be his last. Richard was in full control. Or so he thought. He stretched his arms behind his head, his smirk widening as he soaked in the attention. "You know, mate, I'll give you credit for keeping quiet. Most people who don't belong in first class can't help but gawk at the luxury." A few passengers chuckled, but it wasn't the same as before. The laughter had thinned. Something felt different. A subtle, unspoken shift had settled over the cabin. Across the aisle, the young man who had been watching Jason tensed. His gaze flicked to Jason's wristwatch again. It was distinct, expensive, unique, and dangerously familiar. He stopped scrolling on his phone, his fingers now motionless. His brow furrowed as he stole another glance at Jason's hands. Strong, veined, perfectly steady. Richard, oblivious, kept talking, his voice louder now, trying to hold on to control. "But really, mate, you could have at least tried to dress the part. I mean, a hoodie? Jeans? You look like you walked in here by accident." Jason tilted his head slightly. A slow, deliberate movement. Then, with precise ease, he adjusted his mask, just slightly. It was barely noticeable, but it was enough. For the first time, his jawline was visible. The young man's eyes widened. His breath hitched. He grabbed his seatmate's arm, gripping it tightly. "Dude, look at him." His seatmate frowned. "What?" The young man didn't answer. He was staring. Hard. His pulse quickened. Behind them, a woman who had been watching silently shifted in her seat. At the front of the cabin, a flight attendant walking by faltered, her tray shaking slightly before she quickly steadied it. Passengers began whispering, exchanging glances. The tension was growing, spreading. The energy in the cabin had changed. A man too rose back, nudged his companion. "Hey, that guy. Doesn't he look familiar?" His companion squinted, glancing at Jason, then back at his phone as if trying to match a memory. Another passenger, a middle-aged woman, adjusted her glasses, her lips slightly parted. She wasn't sure why, but something about the man in the hoodie and mask unsettled her. More eyes turned toward Jason, some stealing glances, others staring outright. And yet, Richard hadn't noticed. He was still talking, still smirking, still believing he was the center of attention. But for the first time, he was the only one laughing. The tension snapped. Passengers who had been casually entertained by Richard's mockery were no longer laughing. They were staring, whispering, glancing at each other with growing realization. The young man across the aisle, his pulse racing, couldn't hold back any longer. He blurted out, "That's Jason Statham." The words sliced through the cabin like a lightning strike. For a second, absolute silence. Then, a ripple effect. Heads snapped toward Jason. A woman gasped. A man swore under his breath. At the front, the flight attendant's tray slipped in her hands, barely catching it before it hit the floor. Her eyes, wide with shock, stayed locked on Jason. Passengers leaned in, craning their necks for a better look. Others fumbled for their phones, as if needing confirmation of what their eyes were seeing. Richard, mid-smirk, froze. His confidence shattered instantly. His face paled as his mind desperately tried to catch up with what he just heard. Jason. Statham.
No.
No way. That wasn't possible. Jason, still seated, finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his mask. The moment his face was fully revealed, the reaction was instant. Murmurs turned to excited whispers. More gasps. The whispers turned into hushed exclamations. Someone muttered, "Holy Esich." Passengers exchanged glances of shock, realization, and, most of all, amusement. Because now, they all saw it. Richard. His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted around, searching for a way out of this mess. But there was no escape. Jason finally looked at him.
Come.
Unshaken. Unbothered. Then, with a voice so cold it sent chills down Richard's spine, he said, "You should have thought before you spoke." A beat of silence. Passengers burst into laughter. Richard. His humiliation was complete. Richard sank into his seat, his face drained of color. Passengers who had once laughed with him were now laughing at him. The whispers grew. Some pulled out their phones, probably tweeting about the idiot who just tried to mock Jason Statham. A passenger leaned over to Jason with an eager grin. "Jason, mind if I grab a selfie?" Jason simply shook his head. No words. No need to prove anything. Meanwhile, Richard fidgeted uncomfortably. His hands clenched into fists on his lap. He glanced around, looking for support, but none came. A woman nearby smirked. "Not so chatty anymore, huh?" Richard's jaw tightened, but he had nothing left to say. The plane landed, and as passengers gathered their belongings, Richard hurried toward the exit, head low, whispers trailing behind him.
Jason.
He took his time, walking off at his own pace.
Come.
Collected. Untouchable. A flight attendant, still stunned, stepped forward. "Mr. Statham, if there's anything we can do." Jason simply nodded and walked past. No validation needed. The passengers would never forget what they witnessed. Richard had thought power came from arrogance, from belittling others. But in the end, he was the fool. Jason didn't need to prove himself. Real strength doesn't need validation. As he stepped off the plane, there were no dramatic exits, no parting words, just silence. But that silence, it spoke louder than anything Richard had said that day. Fire never judge by appearance. Some people carry more power than you can imagine. And Jason Statham? He had just reminded everyone why he was in a league of his own. If you like this story, share it with your friends and subscribe for more interesting stories.